Section title: To understand Harriet we must first understand the war. If they think of it at all, people look back on the Underground Railroad in civilian terms, as a quote, movement, end quote, like civil rights. In fact, such comparisons are often made. But the Underground Railroad cannot be understood in civilian terms, because New Africans then were not civilians. Here again it's easy to let ourselves be fooled by the disinformation of patriarchal capitalist history. It's easy to not really understand the distinction between civilian and military. The meaning of these distinctions is important to us, and yet we never think about it. Harriet wasn't an Amazon because she was oppressed, or even because she dissented or rebelled. You're only military if that's what you are. Just because you're oppressed doesn't mean you're at war. Just because you rebel or protest, that doesn't make you a soldier. New Africans still are oppressed, but they aren't armed at war in 2015. That may have been true in the 1960s, the mass ghetto uprisings and the role of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army, but it's not true of the Black nation today. When Harriet and other jailbreak leaders were referred to back then as, quote, conductors, end quote, when the chiefs of local Underground Railroad committees were always spoken of as, quote, station masters, and, quote, brakemen, that was cover. Civilian-sounding words for illegal military activity. Harriet and the rest of the Underground Railroad had military goals, had military strategy and tactics. It wasn't any accident that Harriet and many of the other guides were armed. They were armed as frontline guerrillas who moved through a genocidal terrain. They were soldiers on a military mission, even though they may have been wearing work clothes and not have had a patriarchal military hierarchy anywhere on them. Remember, most Euro settler men back then in the South or on the frontier weren't civilians exactly, either, even though they, too, may not have worn what we recognize as uniforms. Most white men there were armed, as a normal matter. Had to be, when you come to think of it. Most nations of the capitalist metropolis have histories of strict personal gun control, like England and Japan. There, the ruling class was afraid of class warfare. While in settler colonialist societies such as South Africa, the USA, and Israel, settler men have always had armed and militarized mass cultures to help conquer and rule over the oppressed. In its origins as a white man's invasion culture, Team USA itself may have looked civilian to us, but it was really military. The masses of armed settler men were their own military. Banding together in militias or slave patrols or committees or correspondence to commit genocide against Indians. And prison guard their African and women, quote, property, end quote. The ways of life, the culture created by the young Black nation in this furnace, were centered on dangerous and illegal resistance of all kinds. Even their music and their personal lives were part of this resistance. Because without such guerrilla activity they would have had no space for human life at all. Those were the stakes. And the New African political struggle against this armed oppressor had definite characteristics. It was not only conspiratorial and communal, embracing all forms of resistance from illegal education and sabotage to violence, but its only goal was the total destruction of the enemy slave-owning society. That was understood by all. That is, that political culture was inescapably military in its full dimensions, just as its situation was military. Said with emphasis, being disarmed is not the same thing as being civilian, a distinction that patriarchal capitalism loves to mess over in our minds. Section title: New African Women's Unique Situation. For captive women, as Deborah Gray White explains in Aren't I a Woman?, female slaves in the plantation South, their bondage had another dimension from men because of the threat of rape and responsibilities for the children. Even escaping, which every prisoner naturally dreamt of, was something more difficult for most women, who almost always had children to care for. William Still, Philadelphia station master of the Underground Railroad, said that because of the difficulties of fleeing with children, quote, females undertook 3 times the risk of failure that males are liable to, end quote. Deborah Gray White says her own studies of plantation prison runaways in different areas and times consistently show that women were a minority. Quote, in North Carolina from 1850 to 1860, only 19% of runaway ads described women. In 1850, 31.7% of the runaways advertised for in New Orleans were women, end quote. Many of those women who did escape had to leave children behind. New African women also resisted violently, as White points out. Quote, some bondswomen were more direct in their resistance. Some murdered their masters, some were arsonists, and still others refused to be whipped. Overseers and masters learned which black women and men they could whip, and which would not be whipped. Sometimes they found out the hard way. Equipped with a whip and 2 healthy dogs, an Alabama overseer tied a woman named Chrissy to a stump with intentions of beating her. To his pain and embarrassment, she jerked the stump out of the ground, grabbed the whip, and sent the overseer running. Women fought back despite severe consequences. An Arkansas overseer decided to make an example of a slave woman named Lucy to, as he said it, show the slave that he was impartial. Lucy, however, was not to be made an example of. According to her son, she, as he put it, jumped on him and liked to tore him up. Word got around that Lucy would not be beaten. She was sold, but she was never again whipped. End quote. Their greatest resistance was not in these individual acts of anger and bravery, but in what lay beneath it. New Africans imprisoned women created communal networks to sustain and guide each other. Quote, slave women have often been characterized as self-reliant and self-sufficient, end quote, Deborah Gray White reminds us. Quote, yet not every black woman was a Sojourner Truth or Harriet Tubman. Strength had to be cultivated. It came no more naturally to them than to anyone, slave or free, male or female, black or white. If they functioned in groups, end quote. Women more than men were the long-time core of a plantation's multi-generational population. The networks or women's subculture they created with their own leaders and values was a communal survival instrument in the face of dehumanization. White adds, quote, few women who knew the pain of childbirth or who understood the agony and depression that flowed from sexual harassment and exploitation survived without friends, without female company. Few lacked female companions to share escapades and courtship or older women to consult about the vicissitudes of life and marriage. Female slaves were sustained by their group activities. Treated by Southern whites as if they were anything but self-respecting women, any bonded females could forge their own independent definition to which they could relate on the basis of their notions about what women should be and how they should act. End quote.